Hey everybody, this is Tim from Tim and Fran versus the Man. So, you guys have probably seen in the past couple weeks or the past month or so, all of your annoying friends on your feed basically proclaiming that the United States and their coronavirus response is so terrible and they're the new epicenter of the pandemic, and how this proves that the United States and their sort of freedom model has essentially failed. So this is basically the narrative they're going with. But, like I've said before, or what I had attempted to explain to people, is that the lockdowns are technically effective, but only for a brief period of time. Only during the duration of the actual lockdown. The problem is that once you flatten the curve, it's just gonna start spiking back up again. None of that rhetoric ever really made any sense. And I think what you're going to see in the next coming weeks is essentially the entire international community is going to have egg all over its face for making fun of the United States because their case rates are about to go way through the roof. So I initially got this idea because everyone was hailing Vietnam as, it was the pinnacle of what you should do during a pandemic. Never mind the fact that it's essentially a totalitarian government and it took people away from their friends and family if they were sick and put them in a quarantine type, like forcible quarantine camp kind of thing. Never mind the fact that that violates people's rights and, that's not really that important. It slowed the spread of the virus. That's my favorite thing, is when people completely ignore all of the rights being violated. Well, obviously, most of the people that are saying that don't actually care about your rights. They care more about this virus that is relatively, I don't want to say benign, but if you're young, you're probably good. Most people are going to survive this, and people are blowing it out of proportion to kind of a crazy degree, a degree I thought, I hadn't previously thought possible, but of course, I guess I hadn't counted on how easily people fell in line with the propaganda machine. So anyway, everyone's heralding Vietnam as this great example of how the lockdowns and how contact tracing, which is essentially, again, spying on people. You're making them download an app and they're seeing other people who they need to avoid, and then, the state comes in and takes them away if they end up getting the virus or whatever. So, it's true, the lockdowns really did work for Vietnam at first. Now that's important, because what you're seeing in the last couple of weeks is a spike in cases. And the thing is, Vietnam still has a very low case total because they went total, basically total fascist mode and started really, bringing the hammer down on their citizens. And they're like, of course, it decimated their economy. The worst crash since '86 for them. But thank God they prevented this really wimpy disease that barely kills anyone. So now that Vietnam is coming out of the lockdowns because they don't want their entire economy to crash, now their cases are rising again. Granted, they're still very low, and I could technically be wrong about this, but I think it's worth hearing out my theory. I think that there's going to be a second wave in Vietnam, and I think that there's going to be a second wave throughout Europe and throughout all the countries that had very heavy lockdowns. So basically, right now, the people coming in, the people who are getting the virus are actually people who are coming in to Vietnam. So it's not local cases, so people haven't been contracting it there. But the problem is that if Vietnam doesn't want its economy to crash even worse than it already has, they're going to need to keep the borders open, and then they're fucked. Because you can't just close the borders again in the Vietnamese economy because they need those tourism bucks. Their economy is going to crash again and even harder, and their people are going to start starving. Anyone who does a second lockdown, they're going into a Great Depression. It's not, oh, well, it might have some economic concerns. No, you're going into a Great Depression. Millions of people are going to die if you do that. That's not a good idea. Hey everybody, so I wanted to interject because there's a point I don't think I hit home well enough earlier. So basically the reason why Vietnam was able to completely crack down on cases was the totalitarian methods they were using, but also they were closing their borders. But the problem with that strategy is that if they use these totalitarian tactics to stop the spread of the virus in their own country and other countries don't, then they're just prolonging the inevitable, because eventually they're going to need to let tourists in because they need those tourist bucks. Vietnam is very reliant on tourism and cash, as most countries are. So it's not really an option to say, oh, well, that's just because people from other countries are bringing the virus over. It would have been perfect if wrong. And the reason why it's wrong is because, eventually you're going to need to let people into your fucking country if you want money. Or your country is going to collapse. So, they're gonna want those tourism bucks. And the only real way to completely annihilate a disease like this with totalitarian measures is if you basically have a global one world state kind of fascist model. And the only thing that a one world global fascist model would really be useful in is stuff like a pandemic, or maybe getting rid of murders, literally everything else, your life would be a living hell. And you're not going to want to sacrifice, because once they've built that structure in, a structure which can completely just, you know, basically like shut everything down and have you monitored and surveilled at all times, yeah, that's going to be a living hell for you. That's not what you're going to want to do. You're not going to want to reject that idea. You're not going to like that when that actually happens. You're maybe when they sell it to you and they're like, oh, you'll be safe, you might think you're going to like that. You are not. That's not going to be fun for you. That's not for you. You're not going to like that. You're going to regret that decision. So yeah, it doesn't matter how totalitarian the tactics in Vietnam were that worked, because eventually you're going to need tourists to come back. So the lockdowns are still pointless. I mean, if you ever want tourists to come back again, because most countries aren't going to do that, because some countries are going to value their economy and their liberty over that, which you probably should, because, Vietnam's lockdowns are basically going to be rendered pointless soon. Most likely, maybe not, maybe they could pull off something, but most likely they're either going to have to sacrifice their economy or just let this virus burn through the whole population. I think they're probably just going to let it burn through, because they're probably not going to want to sacrifice their economy, because it's already taken a huge hit. And countries that lock down again, they're fucked. They're going into another Great Depression. There is no way, like they're done basically. So yeah. So basically, the new debate is going to be, oh well, we're gonna have to put in all these like soft totalitarian measures in. I don't think that those are going to work very effectively, because most of those only work if like you do it, if you do it in like the first few weeks of the infection, then it could work. And it might like slow down the virus or whatever. It might slow down the virus, but you're really just prolonging the inevitable. Like I've said before, these people are not going to be able to beat this thing. And right now, what you're seeing is Belgium about to completely shut down their economy. Oh, they're talking about it at least. And Spain is Spain's numbers are starting to go way up, up, up. And these are all these countries that have been laughing at the United States and their response. Meanwhile, Sweden is not having the same surge in cases, even though they hadn't locked down the entire time. And we'll have to see what happens to Sweden, but my guess is probably they're going to do fine, because they've reached something approximating herd immunity, something similar to that, or they have gotten culturally used to essentially taking responsibility for themselves, so they're not infecting as many people. Something like that. But all these countries that went into, fascist kind of like, no, we're locking down the entire economy, people are bored. People aren't going to want to stay inside anymore. They're not going to be as cautious. They're going to flood out. Your coronavirus cases are going to shoot through the roof. And then everyone's going to freak out. And if you try to lock down that economy again, because you're left with two choices. Either you just let it go, and then the lockdowns are essentially useless, which of course they were anyway, because obviously, if you looked like 2 feet in front of you, you could tell that the lockdowns are going to be useless. You could tell that, and the reason you could tell that is because if you actually thought it through, then you would understand that it's just going to spike back up again if it's so infectious, and if the virus truly is that infectious, like, you're not going to be able to like beat it down just by flattening the curve. You would need to literally completely snuff it out, and the only way to do that would be going full like fascist mode and completely like destroy anything resembling a society you would want to live in. Hey everybody, interjection number 2. I see you admiring my new cool style. That's how I keep up with the kids. That's how I, people are always being player haters. I hate that stuff. You got to keep it 100. That's really what it's all about. So, anyways, another point that I don't think that I drove home enough in the video is basically this, because I know I'm going to get people who are going to hear what I said about flattening the curve and how it's pointless, and they're going to say, well, Tim, what about overwhelming the medical system? Wasn't that the point of flattening the curve? And I can see why you would think that, but that's essentially because we have these really shitty, centralized or heavily regulated medical systems that are barely efficient, can barely operate. But the thing is, that's the model that everyone has chosen to go off of, because a long time ago, a bunch of the medical industry essentially lobbied for it, and then we just haven't talked about it since. So basically, the world model is very shitty because none of it actually reacts to market mechanisms. So, for example, if you have a hospital and there's a regulation that says you're not allowed to extend yourself, you're not allowed to build another hospital unless you get special permission from this agency, which is a real regulation that they had to cut in order to make our coronavirus response faster. Yeah, it's going to make things a lot slower during a pandemic. But the thing is that in that setting, in a voluntarist, free market, whatever you want to call it, spontaneous order kind of setting, when you have a bunch of people who are getting sick, well, then there's money to be made in quickly creating new temporary hospitals and things like that. The system's not going to get overwhelmed unless it's some like crazy kind of like, maybe if there's like really like a black plague, okay, yeah, then maybe our medical system would be overrun or whatever, but it would have been, it would have been really regardless of that. So the reason why everyone's talking like that, the reason why everyone's saying, oh, well, our medical apparatus, it can't be overwhelmed. The reason why everyone's saying that is because they're so used to having these shitty centralized medical systems that they literally can't think outside of them, because you basically have them everywhere, because everyone has like a shitty medical lobby that wants to like centralize their power and make more money. So they like literally cannot fathom a system that actually reacts quickly based on market mechanisms, which is what market mechanisms are designed to do. I don't know. Remember when there were those food shortages that were happening in the U.S. for like a minute, and then they were fine, and then in socialist countries that's happening all the time? Like during the beginning of COVID, you remember those food shortages? They lasted for what, like a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe two, and then they were fine? Yeah, that's the market at work. You know, if you were living in a centralized like country where the state took control of all that, or the state was handling it for you, that would just be your life. Your life would just be like that. Something to think about. Anyway, back to your scheduled programming. So, my theory is essentially that in the next couple weeks or in the next month or so, it might even take a month and a half, but Europe is going to get a massive amount of egg on its face. All these countries who've been mocking us, not just Europe, but Asia, South America, all these places who have been mocking the United States, they're going to get total egg on their face. This is totally going to fuck up the globalists and their sort of narrative that they want to push, like, oh, America is super backwards and totally dumb. Because that's kind of what it seems like was trying to be pushed with a lot of the international media, was attempting to make America the whipping boy, the scapegoat for everything. I think these people actually hung themselves. I think that they're fucked. I think that there's going to be a second wave of this thing. I don't think that they're going to be able to contain it in any meaningful way. And I'm not even sure if there's going to be a legitimate vaccine to come bail them out. Certain scientists have already talked about there not being a vaccine that's going to work. And even if it does work, it's going to be for like a pretty short duration. Because the protective antibodies go away pretty quickly. So essentially, Europe, Asia, South America, all these countries that had a very heavy lockdown, now that people are out, they're going to want to see friends and family again. They're going to feel a little hubristic. They're going to be like, oh, well, we've solved the problem, because that's what their leaders have essentially told them. That's what the media has been telling them, basically, that they solved the problem. Oh, they flattened the curve. They're patting all these people on the back like they're little children. And now... now they're fucked.